or so, I'll be taking you on a journey between two countries, France and Brazil, focusing on regions within them. These are the départements of Algeria, integrally part of France during this period, and the northeast of Brazil, specifically Pernambuco, in the 1950s. So I just have a couple maps to give you an idea of this because they're so geographically and culturally different spaces. So the first is these départements of Algeria, and a few words about the specificity of French colonization here. So département or department is the sub-regional administrative division in the French state. And the difference of Algeria from other French colonial spaces is that the three departments up here in the north were not only the closest colonies to France, right across the Mediterranean, but also because they were governed they were governed by the Ministry of Interior rather than the Ministry of Colonies. And so this is just to put you into a context of 1950s France in which most French people considered Algeria integrally part of France, despite the discriminatory legal code against indigenous and native peoples. The other place which makes up today's talk is the northeast of Brazil. So roughly this area right here. This is a map that I pulled offline just to illustrate of the economic occupation of Brazil in the 16th century, so the early colonial period, and the degree to which the sites are red are the number of sugar mills in a given area. So right here is the region of Gilberto Freire, the sociologist that I'll be talking about today, where the city is Olinda and also the more modern city of Recife right next to it. So here in the early colonial period, it's kind of the capital of the sugarcane economy based on plantations and massive slave labor. And Gilberto Freire's Masters and the Slaves, a kind of iconic and even iconoclastic book in the 1930s. It changes in meaning later. This book, he claimed the importance of this region in understanding Brazil's ethnic and cultural background as being African. So in the 30s, this is a progressive argument. In the 1950s, as I will show, it's something entirely different. So from the outset, there seems as though there's nothing linking these places. But as I will demonstrate today, they were connected by a set of intellectuals projecting upon them and thinking about them. These intellectuals included historians Lucien Febvre, co-founder of Annales, Fernand Braudel, the future editor of the same, George Gervich, editor of Cahiers Internationaux de Sociologie, then France's most important sociological journal, sociologist Roger Bastide, who worked on Afro-Brazilian religions, among other things, and even the literary scholar, philosopher Roland Barthes. I use the word connected rather than world or global, largely out of humility. These intellectuals span continents in their travels and in their writings, their thinking, but that does not make this story about the globe. For indeed, it was a very particular world, geographically and socially speaking. This is a project that examines the social lives of a set of intellectuals recognized as intellectuals. Surely a different connected history could be written about structures, population movements, or labor relations between Brazil and the French Empire. But this is not exactly the story that I'm going to tell today. Instead, the story that I will tell is about a Brazilian sociologist named Gilberto Freire, known for his writing on Brazil's mixed racial formation, and a handful of French intellectuals who knew him as early as the 1930s and continued to embrace his work into the 50s. By the 1950s, Freire became an important member of French social, scientific, and intellectual life. His book, The Masters and the Slaves and the Northeast, were translated and reviewed by the likes of Braudel and Roland Barthes. Lucien Febvre, editor of Annales, and sociologist George Gervich visited him at his home in Pernambuco. They invited Freyre to France, where he presented his work at the Sorbonne, the École Pratique des Hautes Études, and at a several-day workshop at the Château de Cerisy in Normandy. So what did these French intellectuals see in Freyre, and why did they continue to value his work even after it began to be discredited in Brazil, the US, and at UNESCO in the heart of Paris? I will argue today that in a period in which decolonization was already underway, Freyre offered French social scientists the utopia of a new kind of empire that would transcend the dichotomy between colonizer and colonized. Coming out of the worst ethnic genocide in history, in which the French government actively took part, these French intellectuals embraced racial mixing, or métissage, in part to denounce racism and ethnic purity, and in part to blunt independence movements emerging in the colonies. Recent work has emphasized the openings and closings of certain kinds of imperial politics during this period, as well as the non-inevitability of decolonization. Nonetheless, by 1954, Algeria had entered into what historian Matthew Connolly had called total war, limiting the possibilities of a peaceful solution between France and its rebellious département, as Algeria's cause gained force in international opinion. Nonetheless, this did not prevent, on the contrary, encouraged the reception of Freyre in France. Today, I'll focus on Freyre's role as an ideologue for Portuguese dictator Salazar's colonial policies in Africa, and the remarkably positive reception of his views in France during the same period. Freyre, as early as the 1930s, defended Portugal's role in the colonization of Brazil, favoring renewed ties with Portugal at the expense of what he saw as new kinds of political, economic, and cultural colonialism. Specifically, he was wary of the United States, England, and the capitalist system that they largely controlled. If unchecked, he argued, these countries would seek to control places like Brazil and the Portuguese Empire, imposing their way of life. In contrast to the quote-unquote Anglo-Saxons, Freyre insisted on the particularly human character of Portuguese colonization based on racial mixing or mestiçagem. So, here's an image of Freyre in the Namibian desert during his African tours, which I will come back to. And I just wanted to give you a quote to give you a sense of the ideology that he was projecting. So here is Freyre in the world that the Portuguese created. This human character of Portuguese colonization, if in Brazil it had its broadest and happiest expression, is nonetheless common to Portuguese colonial efforts in general. Everywhere that this type of colonization predominated, racial prejudice appears insignificant, and mestiçagem is psychologically, socially, and might we even say ethically active and creative. When Freyre lived in Jim Crow America during his undergraduate studies at Baylor University in Texas, he witnessed the poverty of black neighborhoods and heard firsthand of lynchings. This is what Joan Scott called a coming to consciousness for the young Freyre, an event that produced his subjectivity as non-American. Whether or not the racialized ghettos of the US South were all that different from the macombos of his native Recife is besides the point. Racialized North America encouraged the young Freyre to look for models other than the US, and ultimately to insist on Brazil as an antithesis to countries in which formal, legal, racial segregation predominated. By the 50s, at the height of the Cold War, Freyre's idea that Brazil was a racial democracy took on a more specific meaning, as a third way between the US and the Soviet Union, not only economically, but also racially. He wrote, for example, of Salvador, also like his native Pernambuco in Brazil's northeast, also one of the centers of the slave plantation economy. And this is what he wrote. Bahia leads the way, as in no other city of the world today, in the fraternally mestizo world towards which man marches forward, if the atomic bomb does not interrupt him. In Bahia, Salvador de Bahia, and not in New York, where antagonisms are admirably tolerated in their differences but do not balance or complete each other in new formations, nor in Moscow, where intolerance might not affect men of color, but affects the color of their ideas, only allowing the orthodox red. An inhumane attempt by a dictatorial or totalitarian government to prohibit the ideas of men from mixing in such a way that the results would be mestiçamente balanced in their contradictions. So you'll notice that he not only uses the word mestizo or mestizo in Spanish frequently to talk of the actual subject, a mixed race Brazilian, but he also uses it quite metaphorically and grammatically in the adverbial sense to say anything that is mixed or mixing here. So according to Freyre, in the US, the politics of difference prevented new combinations of people. In the more racially tolerant Soviet Union, on the other hand, red orthodoxy prevented free expression and new combinations of ideas. In contrast to the superpowers, Brazil was both racially and economically welcome to mixing. This is Freyre. A considerable corpus exists on Freyre's political and racial thinking in Brazil, Africa, and in general. Building upon it, I consider French intellectuals' embrace of Freyre's thought at a time when it was coming under criticism, both in Brazil and abroad, and to be quite precise, at UNESCO in the heart of Paris. Freyre toured the Portuguese Empire, as this image of him alongside a shepherd in the Namibian desert suggests. He lectured on Portuguese openness to racial mixing, and he downplayed the roles of whites in the exploitation of black labor. All of this made up his Luso-tropicalism, the ideology of a special type of colonization, Portuguese colonization in the tropics, that united former Portuguese colonies, ultimately superseding the nation, Portugal itself. As France's African colonies more vociferously and violently demanded independence, especially Algeria, Freyre's thought offered a tempting, peaceful alternative in the form of racial mixing to the rise of ethnic nationalism. These intellectual arguments built upon the political and economic arguments of a new federation between France and its colonies in the post-war period that undergirded the French Union and then the French community. Today, I will highlight the connectedness of Freyre's work and that of the non-communist French social scientists in the 1950s. In so doing, I will draw parallels between Freyre's Luso-tropicalist discourses and French Republican ideology and Latin humanism upon which it was based. So, Gilberto Frere's French reception, I should just say a few words about his US experience and reception there prior, because it did precede the French reception. So Gilberto Freyre was trained in the US after doing his undergraduate at Baylor, working with anthropologist Franz Boas at Columbia University, among other scholars. However, Freyre's conspicuous contact with the French social scientists, particularly in the 1940s and onwards, suggests, if not necessarily a turn away from the US, at the very least a broadening of his intellectual network and prestige. So I have this slide up, Freyre and the French social scientific community, and I'm going to leave it up even though it might be hard for you to read from there, just because there are a lot of people and names that I'm going to be mentioning to kind of construct this. And I wanted to leave a set of references up here, even though I'm going to be talking more around this than through it. So Freyre maintained cordial and even friendly relationships with the French professors who taught at the University of Sao Paulo in the 1930s. He dedicated his book Region and Tradition to the French professors Paul Arbus Bastide, Roger Bastide, and the geographer Pierre Monbeg in 1943. Bastide corresponded extensively with Freyre from 1938 onwards, ultimately visiting him in Recife. This is a common thing. Brodel favorably reviewed Casa Grande Senzala, The Masters and the Slaves, while he was in a prison camp in Germany during World War II. And immediately following the war, he sought Freyre's participation in Annales. Freyre's most important French ally, however, was an older person, Lucien Febvre, founder and editor of Annales, and president of the sixth section of the École pratique des hautes études, which many of you nowadays will recognize as the EHESS or EHESS. Following Febvre's visit to Brazil in 1949, he was the one who helped to consolidate Freyre's position at the height of French academic life. Freyre's itinerary to Brazil in 1945 and Latin America more generally was by no means centered on Recife. Freyre, however, insisted that Febvre go to visit him, in addition to the traditional bastions of French university influence in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. Upon Febvre's arrival in Brazil, Freyre penned an article outlining the credentials and intellectual background of this eminent visitor entitled Professor Febvre in Brazil. Febvre, of course, had known of Freyre's work as early as 1943 when Braudel published his review of Freyre, and all evidence suggests that it was Febvre who sent Braudel the book. Febvre was in Paris during the war, Braudel in the officers' prison camp, that it was Febvre who got Braudel the books to review in the first place. And it appears as though Febvre and Freyre met personally in Paris in 1948 as well. In a letter from 1949, Febvre, writing Freyre from Sao Paulo, thanked him for his, quote, charming article, unquote, that touched him. He was happy, too, that Freyre, I quote, had good memories of the hours we spent together at Val de Grace in Paris, unquote. Unfortunately, Febvre's archive contains no letters from Freyre, but Febvre's letters to Freyre, as well as his notebooks from his trip, help him to reconstruct his visit to Recife. It was his last stop on his whirlwind trip that took him from Chile and Porto Alegre, Sao Paulo, Belo Horizonte, and Rio in Brazil. After his trip, upon his return to Paris, Febvre wrote to his dear friend or cher ami, Freyre, I quote at length, "I am once again Parisian, and above all, descended from heaven, my mind still filled with the beauties of America. I write to thank you, because you guided the entire end of my voyage in the most touching and effective ways. I saw Recife, her wide landscape of white water and of clouds, her charming bridges as old as those of Europe, her narrow roads with the talkative people of humble stock. I saw Olinda, her old churches, her remarkable convent of St. Francis. I saw one morning Gilberto Freire's home, and all around it his so typically Pernambucan garden, with its old trees and young flowers. I saw one of your young relatives who entertained by himself an old talkative Negro, mannerful, with lively eyes." Febvre's vision was little more than picturesque, of course. Then again, the very book upon which it was based, Freyre's Recife Practical, Historical, and Sentimental Guide to the City, was too. Of course, the talkative, mannerful Negro was equally part of the landscape, not as a historical subject, but as decoration like the trees and flowers. This too was not entirely different from Freyre himself, who, despite valorizing African civilizations in some abstract sense, never really considered Africans or Afro-Brazilians as agents in historical processes. Freyre not only showed Febvre around his native Recife. From Febvre's letter, it appears as though Freyre accompanied him to places as far away as Goiânia and Iguaçu on the Argentine border. Freyre introduced Febvre to popular folklore, folkloric traditions such as Cavalo Marinho and Bumba Meu Boi, the postcard of which is in his archive. So this helps to show not only specifically the links between Freyre and Febvre, but also the likelihood, in addition to their correspondence, that this was the kind of ceremony, an Afro-Brazilian interpretation of the Bumba Meu Boi, which can be more Portuguese or indigenous, depending on the region, that Febvre became familiar with because of his connections with Freyre. So Febvre, this is Freyre, this is what he did to Febvre. He dazzled him with, I quote, all that he did not know about Brazil. For Febvre, Brazil, considering its regional diversity, was nothing short of a miracle. I quote, what a subject of meditation. Febvre's curiosity about Brazil and his enthusiasm for Freyre as a person may have been the primary reason for the translation of Casa Grande and Senzala, which ultimately Roger Bastide translated. Febvre was the preface writer of this. In his preface, Febvre praised Freyre, highlighting his annales-like methodology of doing social history, as well as his approach to racial mixing. Febvre's reserves and criticism about Casa Grande e Senzala were largely tempered, if not entirely removed. Gervich wrote to Febvre in June of 1952, I quote, Mr. Lucien Febvre has already written a preface for your beautiful book, but he is in the process of rewriting it because he was more severe than he would like. I will take care of it. Brodel too. Gervich's I will take care of it, Brodel too, suggests that Febvre's peers intentionally blunted his criticism. In the absence of Febvre's original drafts, I cannot say whether Febvre's reservations about Freyre's maître esclave were methodological or political and ideological. It is clear, however, that Gervich and Brodel saw to it that they were toned down or eliminated in the final version of the preface. In the preface, Brazil, Land of History, Febvre leaned towards the picturesque, describing, I quote, the fusion of races and, I quote, the new society that was elaborated between the equator and the Capricorn, unquote. This society, he continued, offered, I quote, a palette of graded tones, from leather red to rosy white. These are people that he's talking about. Febvre reproduced Freyre's exotification of darker women's bodies, describing the black women that he had seen in Salvador as, I quote, big-chested, as if it were ready to spill out over her lace, unquote, and the Amerindian women that he imagined in the colonial period as, I quote, well-made, robust, clean, still healthy, and instinctive, without bothersome sexual decency, completely naked. However picturesque Febvre's preface may have been, it was not blind to the violence and brutality of slavery. Febvre, perhaps more than Freyre, emphasized the annihilation and exploitation of non-European peoples that laid the foundation for Brazilian society. And here I quote Febvre at length. Let us not be simplistic. There was nothing idyllic about the life of Indians upon contact with colonists, nor that of blacks who survived when the sugar industry was implanted. With the large amounts of physical force that it required, it was necessary to look for a more resistant workforce than that of Indians. No, nothing idyllic. It is easy to accumulate testimonies, narratives of so many horrendous acts. Blacks tied living by the mouth to a cannon and receiving the projectile through their body, or mulatres, or mulatas, loved by their master, whose jealous white wife, for once and for all, ordered that they rip out her beautiful eyes, and that they serve them at dessert, entirely bloody, to the unfaithful husband. It is no longer worth our while to bemoan paternalism when we need to scream out man's suffering. But, alongside such scenes, there are many others, more consoling for humanity, and, I will say, as a historian, with greater consequences for the future. Febvre's criticism of Brazilian slavery, so abrupt after his light-hearted and colorful description of Brazil, overpowers and even contradicts the rest of his preface. Indeed, it is likely this section that he was working on when Gervich wrote, I will take care of it. In Febvre's view, however much Freyre might have erred as a historian in presenting the Portuguese colonizer as inherently benign, as a social theorist he was correct in seeing the promise of racial mixing. In a Europe recently destroyed by war and extreme ethnic cleansing, and in a French empire that seemed increasingly divided between colonizer and colonized, Febvre looked to South America as a source of inspiration. Europeans, I quote, haunted by what the world is becoming, are turning their eyes in an anguished search towards these immense South American lands, so rich in promise, unquote. South America, Febvre insisted, brought to light, I quote, the largest problems that are facing, in 1952, the carriers of the old European civilization. Among these problems, probably the most important was the right, I quote, of peoples of color to be free from the yoke of the civilized white man, Febvre's words. Febvre recognized this right, but he worried about the increasing divisions between societies and their visions of progress, something that he personally experienced vis-a-vis science with its increasing capacity to, I quote, annihilate humanity, unquote. He was obviously referring to the atomic bomb. The world, instead of addressing its most pressing questions, Febvre claimed, entered into revolution. And it is here, and precisely here, that Febvre saw Gilberto Freire as providing, I quote, a grand lesson in Brazilian history, a privileged experiment in the fusion of races, the exchange of civilizations, this Brazil, a melting pot. Prior to writing his introduction to Maître Esclave, Febvre had his own ideas for understanding French history as one of racial mixture. In his manuscript written in 1950 and published posthumously, We Are Mixed Bloods, Nous sommes des sangs mêlés, Febvre insisted that France had always been a mixed civilization. Even if Febvre was primarily concerned with the different European origins of France, ranging from the primordial synthesis of the Franks and the Gauls, to late 19th and early 20th century immigration, there is no question that his positive treatment of racial mixing led him to valorize Freire's work. Febvre's willingness to write a preface to Freire's Maître Esclave represented an enormous gain for Freyre, regardless of the eventual criticisms within it. But Febvre was not alone in embracing Freyre in France. The promotion of Maître Esclave, again, the masters and the slaves, was particularly well coordinated, both in and outside of the academy. In addition to Freire's support in placing his book within the French academic mainstream, Freyre counted on sociologist Gervich for its dissemination. Freyre and Gervich had met in Paris, like Febvre also had, at UNESCO in 1948. But their relationship flourished and expanded in 1952 when, at the request of Gervich, Freyre arranged him an invitation to teach in Brazil. So I will cut down this section a little bit, but just to give you a sense and tone of their correspondence, as well as the kind of inequalities between French and Brazilian intellectuals, I'll quote Gervich here in writing to Freyre in 1952. I dream of relaxing a bit, of being invited to Brazil for 1 year. Rio de Janeiro, Bahia, Sao Paulo, or any other Brazilian university or institution would do the trick. I would be very happy to see Brazil again and to have the freedom to finish my book, ironically entitled Social Determinisms and Human Liberty. In Paris, I am too busy. Could you help me to get invited to a Brazilian university? If so, I would be very grateful. Gervich and Freyre continued to write each other throughout 1952. Gervich served as Freyre's an intermediary with the publishing house Gallimard about the forthcoming publication of his book. They discussed various possibilities for Gervich to have a sojourn in Brazil, and Gervich expressed interest in Freyre's forthcoming book on Asia and Africa, I quote, to which we look forward, unquote. Ultimately, Gervich received an invitation from the University of Pernambuco to teach, and at the Casa Rui Barbosa in Rio, where he lectured in 1952 and spent his free time finishing off his book. And I say this not because of Gervich himself, but to understand that Freyre in return could count on Gervich's support in France. Upon Gervich's return to Paris, just months after the publication of Maître Esclave, he wrote Freyre to keep him abreast of its reception. I quote, I can assure you that your book has been very successful in France. It was discussed at length in Combat. We speak of it often, and it was even cited in discussion during a recent session at the Faculty of Letters, the Sorbonne. They say that it sells well. I am preparing a review for the Cahiers, number 14. In addition, Gervich insisted, I quote, "Our friend Brodel and I are actively working to prepare some good surprises for you upon your arrival in Paris this spring. The École pratique des hautes études and the Centre d'études sociologiques are looking forward to your lectures." Beyond the discussion in Combat to which Gervich alluded, Freyre's work was much more widely received in France. Roland Barthes, as I mentioned, reviewed Maître Esclave in Lettres Nouvelles, and Jean Pouillon did the same in Les Temps Modernes, which is Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir's journal review. The French, according to Bastide, understood the book's, I quote, "human significance alongside its scientific value." Bastide ultimately came to disagree with some of Freyre's conclusions, but that did not prevent him from translating Casagrandis and Zala. Just as Febvre's reservations about the cruelty of slavery did not prevent him from writing a general preface, a generally favorable preface either. In 1950s France, Freyre was on the rise both in and outside of academia. Heralded for his affinities with Annales, he became one of the two non-French and the only non-European member on the directors committee of the Fondation Marc Bloch being the other co-founder of Annales. Freyre's personal connections with Brodel and Gervich ensured his dissemination among historians and sociologists. And literary figures in and outside of the Sorbonne embraced his particular brand of Latin humanism. Freyre's unquestionable emergence in 1950s France, however, is only part of the story. For at precisely the same time, his work was coming under attack in Brazil and in Paris, but not in French universities at UNESCO. Unfortunately, I don't have time to sufficiently address these critiques today, but I will say a few words about the UNESCO project on race relations. In the late 40s and early 50s, UNESCO's Department of Social Sciences, head by Swiss-born anthropologist Alfred Métraux, conducted research into regions of the world that they perceived as having high degrees of racial harmony. After the Second World War, this was an interesting inquiry for obvious reasons, and despite the US's hegemonic power on the world stage, few were inclined to follow its model of apartheid. So in this inquiry, Brazil was seen as the prototypical example, and 4 sites were chosen for research, Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Salvador, and Recife, to empirically verify whether this racial harmony existed. Ultimately, some of the most severe critiques of Freyre came out of Sao Paulo, led by sociologist Roger Bastide, who also translated his book, and Brazilian sociologist Florestan Fernandes. In 1953, they published a study on relations between blacks and whites in Sao Paulo, and they argued that Brazil, far from being a racial paradise, was a highly discriminatory society. The persistence of inequalities in the workforce derived from slavery, which was only abolished in 1888, and the competitive urban workforce in which whites distinguished themselves from blacks proved the contrary. I can speak about this more during the questions, but for now, it should be noted that empirical research largely repudiated Freyre's claims, as well as making him appear more of a dilettante than the Brazilian sociologist, which he was recognized as previously. So to summarize the first and the second part, we have a generous, well-planned reception of Freyre by some of France's most prominent academics, starting in the early 40s and 50s. And the publication of UNESCO studies, including those of Bastide and Fernandes, that largely repudiated Freyre, and this is happening concomitantly. Nonetheless, Freyre continued to be relevant in France despite these criticisms, and this is the final part of the presentation. So, in 1956, 3 years after the publication of Bastide and Fernandes' relations between blacks and whites in Sao Paulo, and after the French translation of Freyre's second book, The Northeast, Gervich and Sorbonne philosopher Henri Gouillet organized a several-day conference for Freyre at the Chateau Cerisy-la-Salle in Normandy. So here is an image of the chateau and the text announcing the conference below, which is in French, but I will obviously speak about it in English. So this conference, entitled Gilberto Freyre, a Master of Brazilian Sociology, continued to valorize Freyre in 1956, despite severe criticisms of his work by Brazilians, Americans, and to a lesser extent by Bastide himself. Although the aging Febvre did not attend, he would die within a year, Brodel, Arbus Bastide, and Roger Caillois, as well as others, did. Freyre seemed to offer these French social scientists a utopia of a new kind of empire that would transcend the dichotomy between colonizer and colonized. While it may also be true that Freyre's method and way of doing history earned him sympathy beyond the actual content, the political ideology of racial mixing as a solution to tension and antagonism were no less important. Claude Lévi-Strauss's absence from the conference suggests that Freyre's generous reception was far from universal, and I'll return to this in a moment. Instead of outright rejection, however, those who were lukewarm about Freyre remained largely silent. Febvre's fear of an increasingly dichotomous relationship between colonizer and colonized, expressed in his preface to Maître Esclave, took on a new magnitude in this conference. In the specific context, with a turn in the Algerian conflict that many people saw as race war in France, a number of important French social scientists met in this castle in Normandy to discuss Freyre's work. Here's Bastide's description of the conference. I quote at length, "What should we think of the luso-tropical solution to the racial question of which Gilberto Freyre has become the defender? Is the interpenetration of civilizations the proof of the absence of prejudice? Can the affectionate paternalism of the Portuguese become a racist solution to the problem of exploitation of one race by another instead of a solution based on love? How can we envision the disappearance of color prejudice, and what is the best way to organize a fraternal community between races?" Bastide, while keeping open the possibility of Freyre's thought as a racist solution, in general praised it. Unfortunately, there are no minutes from this conference or other documents to know exactly what was discussed during these 3 days in Normandy. The only traces are those left by Freyre, who chronicled his experience for the Rio-based journal O Cruzeiro in Brazil. Freyre did not specifically mention the discussion of his racial theories, but he did insist that the conference was like a doctoral defense with difficult questions being raised, and we can infer from Bastide's opening of the possibility of it being a racist solution that difficult questions were indeed raised. Because of our lack of sources, it would be irresponsible to claim a direct relationship between this conference in Cerisy and the interest of intellectuals in maintaining the status quo in Algeria, in the French Empire more generally. This would be a reach. What is interesting, however, is the search by social scientists, and some of the most important ones of the period, in this specific moment, thinking about racial problems together. As a solution to decolonization, Freyre seemed to offer them the idea of mixing, métissage, but this was not the only possibility on the table. And now, again, I'll return to Lévi-Strauss, not because I think it's inherently more important than other thinkers, but instead because of the very close overlapping connections between him and Freyre and the very conspicuousness of his absence at this conference. So if Freyre valorized racial mixing and cultural mixing, Lévi-Strauss had the opposite approach. In contrast to Freyre, Lévi-Strauss's Race and History offered another solution built not upon the fusion of cultures, but on their relative independence and autonomy from one another. According to Lévi-Strauss, the recognition and cultivation of human diversity should be UNESCO's goal, and by extension that of the nation-states that made it up. In his famous deconstruction of race, Lévi-Strauss insisted on culture. For him, progress was neither continuous nor necessary. While he shared the fears of Freyre and other humanists about the increasingly mechanical Western civilization in its, I quote, North American form, Lévi-Strauss approached the question of cultural mixture quite differently, at least in the short term. Seeing the drive for economic development and cultural homogenization as annihilating difference, and therefore reducing future cultural permutations, much as a limited gene pool would reduce genetic variation, Lévi-Strauss argued instead for the cultivation of difference. Beyond Marxist criticisms of empire in the same period, Lévi-Strauss and Freyre offered two distinct positions from which to approach empire and its aftermath. Lévi-Strauss favored multiculturalism based on a cultivation of difference, whereas Freyre favored cultural and racial mixing. The former's natural conclusion was decolonization, whereas the latter's was the intensified fusion of peoples in colonial societies without fundamentally bringing into the question the value of Latin civilization. Lévi-Strauss never had any personal relationship with Freyre, unlike many of his colleagues, and this is despite their shared interest in Brazil. Lévi-Strauss, in the same network of people, also taught in Sao Paulo during the same period. And despite their mutual claims to Franz Boas's legacy. Part of this surely has to do with Lévi-Strauss's reluctance to enter professionally into any question having to do with African civilizations, the continent notably absent from his magisterial, the elementary structures of kinship. Nonetheless, the silence between Freyre and Lévi-Strauss is all the more striking, considering their shared intellectual network, especially Bastide and Brodel, and Lévi-Strauss's own participation at UNESCO, out of which race and history emerged. The silence between the two, at least in part, likely has to do with the politics of decolonization. French social scientists were far from unanimous in their support of French government in Algeria. Lévi-Strauss, Michel Leiris, and even Gurvitch were among the many signatories of the Committee of Action of Intellectuals Against the War in North Africa, published in 1955, their manifesto. The signers of the manifesto, signatories, called for, I quote, the struggle against repression, racism, bloc negotiations, and for the liberation of the continent Africa, the African continent. Trained anthropologist Jacques Soustelle, then Governor General of Algeria, took their manifesto personally for obvious reasons. In a letter dated November 1955, Soustelle praised his cher ami, Lévi-Strauss, for his, I quote, sympathetic comprehension of the people upon which you came to work. Lévi-Strauss had just published Tristes Tropiques in 1955, and that's surely the compliments that Soustelle was extending to him. That said, Soustelle continued, I regret to have to send you herewith a less pleasant message, but you will understand without difficulty that, having found your name among the signatories of the manifesto, I thought I must take a clear and unequivocal position. Lévi-Strauss, in his response, attempted to diffuse Soustelle's anger, all while clarifying his own position, notably that the French government's policies vis-a-vis North Africa, I quote, are what they are, unquote, and that he, like Soustelle, was, I quote, morally obliged, unquote, to take a position. And here I quote Lévi-Strauss. Like many of the other signatories, of course, I have always been convinced, and remain so, that you are doing everything humanly possible to direct our country's policy in the healthiest direction. But it is what it is, and there are extremes where even those who remain most distant from politics consider themselves morally obliged to take position, unquote. For Lévi-Strauss, France's policies in North Africa were unacceptable. In the 1950s, anti-colonial struggles in Algeria and other places in the world radically questioned the permanence of European civilization as the political, economic, and cultural center of the world. The strategies for European intellectuals to cope with these changes, however, were as diverse as the populations that their empires controlled. Among them were radical solutions by which European intellectuals might become the new vanguard by dislocating Europe's centrality. I'll throw in Frantz Fanon, despite him being from Martinique, Martinique, Jean-Paul Sartre, Lévi-Strauss, and more conservative solutions by those who attempted to humanize colonialism, all while insisting on the fundamentally progressive value of European civilization. Freyre became a favorite of those in France who preferred this latter solution, a humanization of European colonialism and civilization. As he became discredited in his own country and in the international field of sociology, Freyre increasingly referred to a Latin civilization as a counterweight to the US and the USSR. He maintained such a posture throughout the Algerian and West African decolonization, all the way into the 70s when Portugal's African empire finally started to come undone. In 1966, Freyre was offered an honorary doctorate at the Sorbonne. He ultimately refused to accept it in a country that overtly criticized Brazil, then governed by a military dictatorship as of 1964. Nonetheless, despite not going to the Sorbonne or France to receive his honorary doctorate, Freyre published an article explaining his reasons why he was not going to the Brazilian public. And in this article, Freyre delineates a very specific Freyrean version of a global France, Latin France, and African France. And I quote, "A France that has inspired the leaders of Black Africa, Brazil's neighbor with its immense Atlantic coast and the great part of its population of African origins. One of those leaders, the admirable President Leopold Senghor of Senegal. A feeling of Latin solidarity that is one of the most capable forces to bring to the world a reorganization outside of Europe. That which Europe has most universal to offer, its Latindade, or Latinness." France may have no longer been the center of the world, if it ever had been. But according to Freyre, it had a fundamental role to play in its reorganization. France's Latinness, like that of the Portuguese, distinguished it from the racist Anglo-Saxon world. And for this reason, because it offered, quote, universal truths of civilization that largely bypassed national or imperial boundaries, it could offer the world, and Africa specifically, a paternalist hand. And at home, France, like Brazil, could offer a republic founded on the principle of equality of citizens before the law, unlike the United States or South Africa. Little mattered to intellectuals such as Freyre and his French counterparts if their vision corresponded to reality. What mattered was constructing models in contrast to overt racial discrimination.